We've just 2 days ago recognised Anzac Day, and sometimes as I look around the world, I wonder if there's ever a moment when there isn't war, when there isn't conflict, when there isn't violence. There seems to be a constant factor or focus in our world, doesn't it? And the question that Christians often ask themselves is, what is the Christian response to issues like war? What is the Christian response to issues like violence? Is pacifism, for example, the only option for Christians, where we choose never to take up arms, even in self-defence? Or are there other options? What is a Christian response then to something like Hitler and Nazism, or Pol Pot, or some of the other atrocities and dictators that have been at work around our world over the centuries? And what do we do also with the hard passages in the Old Testament which seem to depict God as ordering genocides, for example? These are tough and important questions for us as Christians to address. And while I don't claim to have all of the answers, what I want to present to you this morning is with a bit of an overview of how the church has handled these tough issues down through the ages. But I want to begin by saying that first off, Christianity's primary commitment is and has always been to peace and to justice in the world, to reconciliation, to making the world a better place by bringing it under the rule of God. The rule of God, reflected hopefully in the example and efforts of the church, and a reflection hopefully of what is to come when God finally brings all things together under one head, when peace will break out all over the world as Christ takes his rightful place over all of creation. And we get a glimpse of that with the two readings that were read to us today. Old Testament prophet Micah says, "He will judge between many peoples and will settle disputes for nations far and wide. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, and nor will they train for war anymore." And more completely in Paul's letter to the Ephesians, he says, "And he has made known to us the mystery of his will, according to his good pleasure, which he purposed in Christ, to be put into effect when times have reached their fulfillment, to bring all things in heaven and on earth together under one head, Jesus Christ." In other words, there will come a time when Christ returns at the end of what we call the second age, when everything will be finally put to rights. Everything will be finally put to rights. But in the meantime, right now in fact, we live in that in-between time, with the tension of a world that only in part acknowledges God. And our task and desire then as Christians in this in-between time is to see every living human being reconciled to God, their Creator. That's what we want, isn't it? We want to see every human being reconciled to their Creator. We want to see the individual transformed through an openness to the work of the Holy Spirit in their lives, growing in the fruits of the Spirit, where that person is changed into the likeness of Christ. And then we see the world transformed as those changed individuals go out into the world and begin to have an effect and an influence on the world around them, on their neighbours and relatives and so on. As Christians, living as Christians are meant to live, and then going out into the world, being salt and light, we influence the world around us to bring it together eventually in love and peace under the sovereignty of God. That is our hope, and that is our desire, and that is what we are committed to as the church, through evangelism, through the sharing of the gospel, and through our presence in the world just as salt and light in our communities, to change the world and bring it under the headship of Christ. As William Wilberforce once said, being an influence for good through the way we live, but also by direct action. But while that might be our primary commitment, that might be what we want, we also recognise as the church that the future, where all things are completely submitted to the headship of Jesus, is something reserved for the future in its completeness. And right now we live in an imperfect world. We live in a fallen world, a world that is in rebellion against God, where the church's influence can be quite limited at times. So while our desire is to see all of humanity reconciled to God, We've got to also wrestle with how do we live as Christians and the church in a world that isn't quite there yet. And one of those issues that we wrestle with is the issue of war, the issue of the killing of fellow human beings in the pursuit of statecraft, of national and other agendas by politicians and the like. Historically, the church has tended to respond in one of two ways to this issue. The first response of the church was pacifism, where the taking up of arms leading to the killing of a fellow human being was completely and utterly renounced by the early church. And that was its position for the first 3 centuries of its existence. It came from the teachings of Christ, and in particular passages like the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, love your enemies. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who ill-treat you. If someone strikes you on the cheek, turn to him the other. It also drew inspiration from the example of Christ himself, where he refused to retaliate against violence done to him, especially at his trial and crucifixion, where he went like a lamb to the slaughter. And it comes through as the main approach in the extra-biblical writings too, the early church fathers. Origen in 185 to 254, he wrote this, "Nor do we learn war anymore, since we have become sons of peace through Jesus, who is our author." And Irenaeus, writing around about 180 AD, said, "We do not know how to fight, but when struck, offer even the other cheek." And Maximilian, closer to the 3rd century, "I cannot be a soldier. I cannot do evil. I am a Christian." And there do not appear to be any records of Christians serving as soldiers in the Roman army up until around about 170 AD. And so a very good case can be made for the pacifist position. And it seems to have been the position of the church right up until around about 313 AD, when something very significant happened in church history. Does anyone know what it was? Joe, you know now, so you can't speak. No, Crusades are a lot later. 1000. What happened in 313 AD? Emperor Constantine. Constantine's conversion. The Emperor of Rome, Constantine, came to faith, and in what is known as the Edict of Milan in 313 proclaimed religious toleration throughout the entire Roman Empire. And all the persecution that had been happening under Diocletian and the other emperors at that point suddenly ceased. Suddenly ceased. And at that point in time, it seemed like pacifism began to die away from mainstream Christian thought. And it only reappeared again in the 16th and 17th centuries and onwards through the movements of the Anabaptists, the Quakers, the Mennonites, and similar such movements. So that's a bit of the history. So, question, is pacifism the true or only Christian response to the issue or problem of war? Well, possibly not. It is certainly a valid response. It really is a valid response, and it's one that I respect a lot. And it's probably the one that's actually truest to the heart of the gospel. Those who choose the pacifist option often follow a very lonely path in life, and they demonstrate incredible moral courage in the face of the reaction of the societies in which they live. In fact, I think there's a film out now, isn't there, which is actually looking at what happened to some people who became or took a pacifist position during World War I. There was quite a harsh reaction by the military and the societies in which they live. But there are a number of points worth noting about the pacifist position for the early church to begin with. To begin with, a lot of Christians didn't join the Roman army in the first centuries after Christ, because to do so would mean partaking in the idolatrous practices including sacrifices, taking pagan oaths, and participating in pagan ceremonies, which were very much a part of the Roman army. The Jewish people at that time were excused by law, by Roman law, from having to participate in the army for that very reason. The Romans recognised that Jewish monotheism was completely contradictory to the way in which the Romans operated under their polytheism, and so they basically said to the Jews, you don't actually have to join the army. And the Christians were in a very similar position and chose to avoid armed services for those reasons, because they could not participate knowingly and willingly in those kind of rites. And secondly, the Roman army, up until the time of Constantine, was the primary vehicle for the persecution of the church. So why would you want to join an organisation that was actually acting to destroy the church? Then there is the issue of Jesus' teaching and practice. Jesus' teaching about loving your enemies was actually not in the context of war between nation states, but about persecution for the faith that you held. Jesus, it seems, did not tell Cornelius, the centurion, to give up being a soldier, but instead commended him for his level of faith. Likewise, John the Baptist only told soldiers who came to him in repentance for baptism, he only told them to not extort money. He didn't tell them to give up being soldiers. Furthermore, Jesus was not always passive himself. In the temple, he acted in a rather violent kind of way, didn't he? He went into the temple. And I don't think the money changers and those selling the sheep and the dove and the like, they were just standing back going, oh, that's not very nice, They would have been trying to resist what was going on. Jesus went in there and he threw the tables over. He made a whip out of cords and he drove the cattle. There was a riot that was happening in the temple. He acted in quite a strong way because of the corruption that he saw being practiced in the temple. And in many ways his passive response at his trial was because he knew that this was something he could not avoid. Because as he said in the Garden of Gethsemane to the disciples, do you think that I cannot call on my Father and he will at once put at my disposal 12 legions of angels? 12 legions of angels. He was passive because that was the path he was choosing to tread, not because he did not have other options. And finally, the church in those early years was very much an outsider. It was a fledgling organisation on the edges of society. It had no real say in the ruling of the empire. It had no say in civic affairs and policy making, and it had no voice in the ordering of society. It was only later, after Constantine, that Christianity began to make huge inroads into society and in turn into the government. And then as Christians came into those positions where they had responsibility not just for themselves and their individual families, but had responsibilities for cities and towns and for lawmaking and the like, that they had to start asking the question, what is a Christian response to that kind of like bigger responsibility where we are now sitting in these roles of having authority over others in government and the like? And one of the first who sat down and started to think about how that responsibility might outwork was Augustine, Bishop of Hippo. He was one of the church's most prominent theologians, and around 400 AD he promulgated what is now known as the just war doctrine, whereby war was deemed to be acceptable but only under certain conditions. Augustine said that first, war must occur only for a good and just purpose rather than for self-gain. So it wasn't acceptable to invade the neighbouring country because you kind of like coveted their farmland and pasture lands and the like, and because you wanted to raid their treasury or something. There had to be a good and just reason, like the defence of your citizens, maybe from the inroads of bandit bands from those areas. Secondly, a just war must be waged by a properly instituted authority, such as the state. It had to be a recognised authority. And thirdly, love must be a central motive even in the midst of violence. And over the centuries since Augustine put forward those three principles, that original position has been expanded and refined and developed until we have today a set of 7 principles which form the foundation as a way of determining whether or not a war, while not something we want to actually engage in, could be termed in some way just. And I'll read them out to you. A just war can only be waged as a last resort. War has got to be a last resort. You've got to explore all other non-violent options first. You've got to sit down at the negotiating table. You've got to try and use diplomacy, treaties and the like. You've got to be talk. And only when everything else has failed is war a possibility. Number 2, a war is just only if it is waged by a legitimate authority. Even just causes cannot be served by actions taken by individuals or groups who do not constitute an authority sanctioned by whatever the societies and the outsiders deem to be legitimate. You could argue that a dictator is not a legitimate authority, but rather someone acting out of their own self-interests. Terrorism is an example. While it is used in a sense for the waging of war, because they know that when you kill civilians and create terror in a society, you influence policy making. That's one of the reasons for terrorism, because you influence them through that kind of means. It would not be deemed to be just war for other reasons as well, particularly because it targets civilians. Number 3, a just war can only be fought to redress a wrong suffered. In other words, self-defence against an armed attack. 4, a war can only be just if it is fought with a reasonable chance of success. Death and injury incurred in a hopeless cause are not morally justifiable. It may be the situation, maybe we're a very large nation state coming against a small one. The small one could resist to the point of utter devastation, annihilation. But that cost to that nation and the cost to its civilian population and the like could be deemed to be too high. And even though the invasion would be wrong, maybe it would be better not to fight because of the loss of life that could occur. Number 5, the ultimate goal of a just war is to re-establish peace. We must always be working towards peace. Number 6, the violence used in war must be proportional to the injury suffered. States are prohibited from using force not necessary to attain the limited objective of addressing the injury suffered. One of the great debates in the 50s and 60s and beyond was actually whether or not nuclear weapons could be deemed to be used in a just war. And most theologians actually said no, because the level of devastation from the use of nuclear weapons isn't limited just to the military forces. The devastation on civilian populations, upon the land in terms of radiation, upon the destruction of property and so on. It was deemed that in many ways nuclear weapons could never be used in a just war. They served as a deterrent factor only. And lastly, the weapons used in war must discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. Civilians are never permissible targets of war. What just war theorists do is they combine both a moral abhorrence towards war with a readiness to accept that sometimes war might be necessary. The criteria of the just war tradition act as an aid to determining whether resorting to arms is in some circumstances morally permissible. They attempt to distinguish between justifiable and unjustifiable uses of armed organised forces. They attempt to conceive of how those arms might be restrained, made more humane, and ultimately directed towards the aim of establishing a lasting peace and justice. To put it simply, the just war position recognises that despite the best will in the world, there will be times when in order to preserve life, justice and peace, that force must be met with force. That war entered into for the greater good to prevent evil and the like can sometimes be the lesser of two evils, a sometimes painful necessity in a fallen world. War is never good, but sometimes it is necessary. But in order to ensure that that force is not abused, the just war doctrine provides for some parameters or limitations governing the entering into, the conduct of, and the conclusion of the use of force. Sometimes, the just war doctrine often provides the following justifications. Number 1, that war between nation states can be seen as an extension of police action within a state, where force is allowed by a legitimate government and sometimes used to keep the peace, to protect the weak and to maintain justice. We've all got no problem with having a police force, do we? And we know that the police act to protect the weak and to maintain justice, and that sometimes the police have to use violence in the restraining of people who want to act in inappropriate ways and so on. And we've got no problem with there being police force within our nations and acting that way. And then sometimes by extension you can see that police action within a nation can be extended to the way nations treat each other as well, in order to prevent protect the weak, and so on. Such position is often backed up from passages like Romans 13, which reads, "Everyone must submit himself or herself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established." The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but only for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. For he is God's servant to do you good, but if you do wrong, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Now, there were times in history when Christians have interpreted this, or governments have interpreted this, almost in an action of divine right, that all existing governments have been instituted by God. It's actually not what the passage says. What the passage says is the right and the need for human beings to govern themselves has been instituted by God, but that is illegal, that is something that God allows and has called us to do, but that not every person who is exercising governing power is actually doing so legitimately. We have been made in God's image as rational beings with rational faculties. We have been given stewardship of this earth in Genesis. God in effect has given us the ability and the right and the need to govern ourselves and our world in an ordered, functional way, and to preserve that order as and where necessary. It is authority that is the divinely given institution, not individual governments and the like. And where a government acts outside of that and begins to act in an inappropriate way and abuse its citizens, take away their rights and privileges, then it is not acting in the way that God has instituted authority. And secondly, we live in a fallen world. The in-between time of the second age means that we as the church have to make intelligent compromises at times in order to preserve peace, justice, life, and even the church. Paul explains this well in 1 Corinthians 9. "Though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jew I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that by all possible means I might save some. And I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I might share in its blessings." And in following this principle, Paul, who railed against circumcision in Galatians, goes and circumcises his proselyte Timothy. Why did he circumcise Timothy? Because Timothy was working in an environment with a whole lot of Jewish people, and he would not have been heard unless he had actually been circumcised. Being circumcised made Timothy more acceptable to his Jewish hearers. So it was a bit of a compromise. Paul encouraged women to remain outwardly submissive to their husbands, as was the custom of the culture, although internally Christian marriages were more a coming together of equals. Because he knew if women acted out fully the freedom they had in Christ, then it would have been seen as very disruptive in the society. Paul did not seek for the freedom of slaves at the time. In other words, he tried to avoid Christianity creating a storm of civil disruption that would have wreaked havoc on the church by pushing the practical outworkings of Christianity too hard all at once. You know, Christianity proclaims freedom for all. Freedom for all. But if you try and push that all at once, then you're going to get a pretty strong reaction. And so Paul was wise, and he took it step by step by step. Let me give you an example. Should Christians tell lies? You don't know. Should Christians tell lies? No. You don't? You don't think we should? Anyone else? No? So we shouldn't tell lies.
But there might be occasion.
There might be. And I've shared this story before.
Dutch Christians.
That's right. So you're a Dutch family, a Dutch Christian family, and you've got Jews hiding in your house during World War II, and there is a knock on your door, and in walk the Gestapo, and they ask you have you got Jews in your house? What will you say to them? What will you say? If you tell the truth, what's going to happen? You are going to be taken away, and the Jews will be taken away, and they will be murdered. So what should you do?
You ask forgiveness.
You ask for forgiveness.
You say no, and then you say, I'm really sorry, God, and I'm sure you understand. There is a great difference.
The answer is simple. You lie. You lie. But the question is, why should you lie? The real question is, why should you lie? And you lie for two reasons. Number one, there is a ranking in ethical principles. The preservation of human life is a higher priority than telling the truth in some situations. And by lying in this situation, you are preserving human life. But the second answer is more important. This is a situation of the abuse of power over another. The Gestapo agents are working from a different, and I would argue, insidiously evil set of principles. And in no way do they respect your principles that would compel you to tell the truth. In no way would they respect that. They're not concerned with truth. They're not concerned with life. They cannot be reasoned with. They have an evil agenda, and they will think you are a fool if you naively say, yes, I am hiding a Jewish family. So because you are not even operating from the same page, as it were, operating from the same position in respect to the truth, you are not obligated at that point to give them what they want. It's not like two of us having a discussion together or talking with each other, and if one of us lied to each other, then we would be wrong. But in this situation, where you have these agents with power that only want to do evil, they're not going to be swayed by the fact that you tell the truth. And therefore you're not under an obligation to do so, because you are seeking to prevent harm, and you will not be respected for the telling of it. Lying to them is not in the same league as lying to someone who is working in the same way that you are. And there are lots of examples in Scripture where this occurred. Think of the pharaohs, the midwives, the Hebrew midwives with Pharaoh. Remember that story? The Pharaoh decided there were too many Hebrews, and so he said to the midwives, every time a Hebrew woman gives birth to a male child, kill it. And so what did the midwives do? They disobeyed it. And Pharaoh found out about it, and he called them in and said, why are you not doing what I commanded you to do? And the midwives said, it's because the Hebrew women are strong, and they give birth before we even get there. Which wasn't true. It was a lie. And what does the Scripture say? It says that the Lord commended the midwives for what they did and blessed them and their families. What about Rahab, the harlot, in Jericho? The two Hebrew spies come into the city. They spy out the city, and she hides them on the roof of her building under the flax at the top where it's drying out. And the king calls for Rahab and says, where are those two men that were in your house? And she says, they've left. They left the gates. They went out the gate earlier in the day. And you might catch them. They're heading towards the fords of wherever, And so the king sends his troops out after them. She lied. She lied. And what do we know about Rahab? Well, she became part of Jesus' genealogy, didn't she? She became part of the family tree of Jesus. So there are some situations where it is permissible to not tell the truth. I think that's a better way of wording it, isn't it? In a similar way, war, the taking of human life, while wrong at one level, if entered into for the greater good to prevent evil and the like, can be seen as the lesser of two evils in a fallen world. Sometimes war is a painful necessity, but only as a last recourse, and it's from these principles that has sprung things like the just war doctrine. And just as an aside, the just war position actually allows for individuals to take a pacifist position, because it says this: while individuals may choose to renounce all violence, those who must preserve justice may not do so, though it should always be the last resort once all peace efforts have failed. In other words, the individual person may choose to take a pacifist position for themselves, But those in positions charged with and responsible for preserving peace and justice for many do not have that luxury. It's all right for the individual Christian to choose to take a pacifist position. You've got that right. But if you are the leader of a nation, you don't have the right to take that position on the behalf of all the others whom you are serving. For example, if someone came into my home when I was there alone and attacked me, I might choose to allow my life to be taken rather than take the life of another. But if my family is present in that home when that person comes in and attacks me, and the intent is to kill everyone in that home, I don't have the luxury of just saying, I'm not going to take your life. I will act to defend my family. And while I wouldn't seek to take life, that may actually happen. It would be the lesser of two evils. You know, we've got to remember as Christians that we live in this in-between time. We live in a fallen world. We're not yet at the point where Christ reigns supreme over all. And there are some hard positions, hard choices and decisions that we have to take at times between our ideals and the reality of what we're living in and working with. We are always working towards the ideals, always seeking to be salt and light and influence throughout the world. But there are times when sometimes things that we do not want to do have to be done.